that's basically what I've been doing. But when I lived in San Francisco. And then I moved to Lisbon and
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We had more than one technical glitch taking place, but we believe we have everything under control. So thank you so much for your patience. And before we get to our speaker, I need to thank our sponsors, as always. So when I get done, a big round of applause for the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, hold your applause, the Manitowoc Public Library, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Now, more, go for it. All right, thank you so much. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I just wanted to let you know about a program that's coming up on the 28th, not this Saturday, but the Saturday afterwards. It's the 6th annual Lakeshore Area Seed Swap. If you've never been to a seed swap, the people that put it together describe it as a potluck except with seeds. You can show up with seeds, but if you don't have seeds to exchange, you can just show up and get some seeds and get it. And it's all free and an early start on your gardening for the warm weather that's pretending to be here now, but will soon go away again. But soon enough, it will be here for real. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Shale Horowitz is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research has examined international and ethnic conflict, the politics of international trade and finance, and the politics of institutional change. He is the author or co-author of over 60 journal articles and the author or co-editor of 5 books. He has made research visits to China, Taiwan, South Korea, and other countries. His current research looks at Chinese foreign policy, Indo-Pacific political economy and security, and ethno-territorial civil wars, and he has put up with the technical drawbacks of coming to speak at Manitowoc Public Library. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Shale Horowitz.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for coming. It's so gracious of Tim to take the blame for something that was my fault, actually. I could not find the right hookup here, so it was my fault. So again, thank you for being here. And this is, the most important topic in the world, I think. I think it'd be hard to find something else that compares to this. China is the new superpower. In many ways, China is much more powerful than the old Soviet Union in terms of its economic and technological capability, and certainly in terms of its future growth potential. So this is definitely the most important relationship in the world, and it will only get more important. And I think China represents a much greater challenge to the existing world order than the Soviet Union did in its day, for the reasons that we already talked about and we'll get into in more detail. So things have come to a head, obviously, in the last few years. You can see, the 2 leaders there. But, this is a change which has been coming slowly. And then it really has burst upon us in the last, 8 to 10 years, getting progressively worse and kind of speeding up, I think. So let me go on to the next slide here. So we want to try to explain what happened here. Okay, so we were in a period of, like the term that was commonly used for the reform period in China was engagement between China and the rest of the world, engagement between the United States and China. This was sort of like a new type of China that was focused on getting rich and integrating with the rest of the world and getting along with the rest of the world as a means of getting rich. Okay, so that was a break from the early communist-dominated China, which was militantly ideological, was part of this larger global conflict between the democratic West and the communist world led by the Soviet Union.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you could stay at the podium for our internet viewers?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for that, Tim. So I used to tell my students the phrase I used to use, Deng Xiaoping, the second major leader of China after Mao Zedong, the founder, the leader of the militantly communist China. So Deng was the one who wanted to emphasize what he called stability, development. Stability meant no crazy economic campaigns that led to mass starvation, no gigantic purges in which millions of people died, an ordinary way of life for Chinese people and for the Chinese Communist Party too. And development, the primary priority would be internal economic development, because China basically had similar per capita incomes when Mao Zedong died as when he came to power. There was very little economic progress. So Deng was also saying our primary priority is economic development. And again, to do that, we need to partner with the outside world, especially the West. We need to have stable relations. We need to have trade. We need to have investment. We need to have two-way knowledge flows. And I used to tell my students that Deng continues to rule from the grave. So he died in 1997. But he set up these new institutions as well as this new ideology for the Chinese Communist Party. And his two successors that followed him, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, they followed his script very closely. So he set up new goals for China and a new political way of ruling for the Chinese Communist Party. Again, stability, no chaos, no cataclysmic instability, and slow, sure emphasis on internal economic development. What happened to Deng? He was killed by Xi Jinping after he was already dead. So he was killed 15 years actually after he died, when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. So that's one thing that happened. Deng was finally killed by Xi Jinping. We'll talk about that. And that really led to an abrupt break between China and much of the rest of the world, including the United States, which was already getting a little bit frayed, but was still intact, these good relations. And we'll come a little bit later to why it was getting a little bit frayed, but the short answer is China is getting increasingly wealthy, increasingly technologically advanced, and so its capabilities and its impact on the world are changing. China isn't a low-end producer like Bangladesh or Indonesia anymore. It produces high-end telecommunication systems. It aims to equal the rest of the world now in terms of all major high technology areas. We'll come to that point. Sorry, I can't leave the table here. Okay, so why did this happen? Why was the engagement broken? Again, it was because of the changes ushered in by Xi Jinping. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about that because that was the most fundamental reason. And the recent changes under the first Trump administration, second Trump administration, and really continued during the Biden administration too. This is a kind of American reaction, which parallels this larger reaction in the rest of the world. I think we all know more about what is going on in the United States, so I think it's of greater value for me to talk more about what happened in China, and then I will talk some about the U.S. reaction. And then what do both of these things mean? That's the final point about the new world or the new era that we're living in, both in terms of international military security relations and international economic relations, and the increasing interpenetration between these two things, which is a relatively new phenomenon, I think, in international relations that we'll talk about too, meaning that what's happening in the international economy is going to have a more and more direct impact on our military security and other forms of security and stability in society than it did in the old days. Okay, so just to go back to this point, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about Xi Jinping's ideology and goals, and I'm going to stick very closely to what he says his ideology and goals are. Then we'll talk a little bit about the way he actually rules, and then we'll talk about how he has changed China's foreign policies in the area of military security and then in the area of foreign economic policy. And then again, more briefly, the U.S. response and what this means. Okay, so every 5 years in China, there is a kind of marquee meeting of the Chinese Communist Party. So the last two meetings were in 2017 and 2022. 2017 was the year when the first meeting when Xi Jinping had already been in power for 5 years and he had consolidated authority. He was in a position to put his stamp on the Chinese Communist Party and on the future direction of China. So as you can see, they have great PR in China. So the title they came up with for his new ideology was Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. Very sexy, right? I mean, that's kind of a mouthful, but what it reflects is changes within China and the kind of language which is used within the Communist Party, right? Because China is governed very tightly by this authority, this party authority. In the academic world, we call China a party state, meaning that it's not a state with a government, it's a party with a state. Like the old joke they used to tell about Prussia or Germany. It's not a state with an army, it's an army with a state. Okay, so that's the idea. This is like a state possessed by a party, which rules it with this iron fist. Okay, so there are a number of interesting little elements of this weird title here. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, what does that mean? That's an old buzzword within Chinese communism. Originally, Mao Zedong didn't want to be yoked to whatever they did in the Soviet Union. He believed that he was a great leader of international communism. He was a great visionary, and what he was creating was superior to what the Soviet elder brothers had done and were doing. So he called his changes to communism socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now then Deng, as I talked about, decided to break completely from what Mao Zedong did, viewed it as a failure. Himself suffered through the purges of Mao Zedong and the instability of the Mao era. But this was useful to him, right? So he could say he was continuing to pursue socialism with Chinese characteristics. It gives you the ability to take whatever it is you want to do and just relabel it as socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? You're not kind of hemmed into a rigid ideology or a rigid script. Okay, Xi Jinping thought. What does that mean? That means he's putting his own imprint now on the ideological tradition of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's a big move to title it with your own name, right? That means you personally are making significant ideological contributions. And Xi made a point of inserting this into the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, insisting that he was a contributor to the worldview, the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party on a par with the previous great leaders, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And the last part, new era. New era means it's a new era. That's Xi Jinping's era, meaning this is something fundamentally new for the Chinese Communist Party and for China itself. So if you look at these speeches, especially the most important one in 2017, again, he has this concept of a new era, the third era of Chinese communism. The first one is this orthodox period of Chinese communism under Mao Zedong, which had all these problems, which led to the reforms during the second period under Deng Xiaoping. So now Xi is saying, we're done with the second period of Deng Xiaoping, now we're doing something new. And what is it that is the basis of this? So in Xi's opinion, this period of sort of tutelage and growth, during which China was learning from the rest of the world and becoming rich, is now over. China has harvested those fruits, has achieved a maturity, which is allowing it to move into a new era where it is not dependent on the outside of the world. It is not a junior member of some kind of a larger international environment. So one of the buzz phrases, which is very prominent, is national rejuvenation. Okay, so that's the idea that, China means middle country or middle kingdom. It has viewed itself historically as the center of the world. That's China's natural position. So Xi is saying China can now move into that position. That's now becoming a reality again, as it was at various points in the past. And this will mean that China will assume a dominant position in the world, which is viewed as natural from the point of Xi Jinping and many Chinese, understandably given the population of China, given its historical position in the world during the period that preceded Western economic and military dominance. So for most of its history. Okay, let's look at some of these ideological statements again, which are making a similar point. So look at some of these words that Deng used to describe China's foreign policy in the period in which he was leading China. Calm, avoid confrontation, hide your capacities, or conceal your strength. It's sometimes translated, bide your time, right? Meaning, be careful and slowly build your strength, and eventually that will deliver you to your goals. There's no reason for disruption or instability or conflict. It's not necessary, and it's potentially very counterproductive, both for China internally and for its place in the world. So Xi is breaking with that openly, and he talks about China moving closer to center stage in the world on the basis of all of the major dimensions of national power, military power, economic power, cultural power. Returning to the Maoist era point of view that China is going to be competing for leadership in the world, that China has a model that the rest of the world can and should follow. In other words, China is no longer learning from the rest of the world. Now the rest of the world is learning from China. And again, not only is China going to return to this central place in the world, but Xi himself is going to be the agent of that happening. That's important because it means no more patience like Deng had, right? Deng's point of view was, there's no reason we need to rush. This doesn't need to happen in the next 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. As long as this is working for us, we can just let our strength grow, and our position in the world will grow naturally, and everything that we want will just come to us. Okay, so this is a very different viewpoint. This is, we are achieving this during my lifetime. During the time I'm in office, that is what Xi Jinping is saying. Okay, what about, that's what he says. What does he do? What is his method of ruling? Okay, you probably all heard of the anti-corruption campaign. The headline is rooting out corruption in China, where corruption is such a huge problem, of course. But if you actually look at what Xi Jinping is doing, it's not just an anti-corruption campaign, it's also a campaign of continuously removing all alternative centers of power within China, especially within the Chinese Communist Party, but also within other institutions. So he started out by eliminating the leadership networks of the previous supreme leaders, that is consolidating control within the party, and then he moved on to all these other areas. The military, of course, where there have been major purges recently, the Chinese military leadership, the economy, the state, every significant area of organization in China. And this wasn't a one and done. It's something which is constantly ongoing, right? So everybody in any significant position in China is waiting for the knock on the door. It's serious, it's no exaggeration. No one is insulated from it, and it is a constant fear that everybody has to have. And again, this is going back to the way it was in the Mao Zedong period. One of the main points of the Deng period was that we don't want to live like this. Deng himself was purged from power twice. His son was crippled. His family was put through hell as a result of Mao's purges. So he experienced it directly. It wasn't just 30 or 40 million peasants starving in the countryside. It was the Chinese Communist Party itself that suffered. So this was supposed to stop. And there was supposed to be only more regular, occasional prosecutions, only when necessary. And the Chinese Communist Party was supposed to have security like the rest of the country. A second characteristic of Xi is that both in China and in other places, they jokingly call him the chairman of everything. right? Chairman is actually Mao Zedong's old title, which isn't used anymore because no one's supposed to be like him. But it means he wants to control everything, not only control it, he wants to micromanage it. He wants to set up a little committee that he's in charge of, and he wants to oversee every little change which is made. And no one has attempted to do this in China. And it's a little bit crazy because you can't imagine anything more complex than China. Right? I mean, the old expression in Chinese history, the emperor is far away. So if you try to rule the whole country in this way, it's going to be pretty impossible. But he insists upon trying to do this in a way that no other leader has done. Party institutions and norms, Deng tried to regularize rule by the Chinese Communist Party by setting up term limits for the top leaders, supposed to be for the supreme leader, depending upon the position, 10-year term limits. So she ended those. And there were also supposed to be these strict retirement ages, which would force turnover of top leadership. And again, Xi Jinping has compromised that, where he's wanted his cronies that are past the retirement age to remain in positions of power. But the main thing is that he himself from this period, or what Xi Jinping said about this dynasty, which is kind of obviously absurd to educated people or anybody with common sense, because what does Xi Jinping know about Chinese art, right? No more than anybody that goes to the museum knows. But again, I talked to my friends in China, and they talk about, I just talked to a friend of mine, he said he's applying for a translation job. And so they tested him on his ability to translate, and then they also tested him on how he would apply Xi Jinping thought to outreach to the rest of the world. Right? I mean, this is crazy stuff. Okay, so let's talk about actual policy changes now. So again, we're looking at two main areas, military security policies and economic policies, or foreign economic policies. So under Xi Jinping, there has been a rapid military buildup in China. Now, this goes back earlier than Xi Jinping, okay? So really you can date the big increases in the Chinese military spending to the Tiananmen Square rebellion and massacre. Okay, so before that, the Chinese military wasn't getting very many resources. Then all of a sudden they started getting these big budget increases because they saved the Communist Party at that time, right, from the protesters in 1989. Now, what's different under Xi Jinping is China's military capabilities are reaching a very high level of technological maturity, and you're seeing qualitative changes in the nature of what the money is being spent on in China and what kind of capability it delivers. Okay, so the reason why we're reaching this point is because what China is spending on its military is starting to approach what the United States spends on its military when you take into account purchasing power in China, meaning that like $1 million in China goes much further than $1 million here. If you just translate that into Chinese yuan, it buys you a lot more buys you a lot more engineers, buys you a lot more pieces of hardware, and so on. So China is starting to field a military which is actually qualitatively competitive with that of the United States, although most experts think it's not there yet, but it's starting to approach that. So for example, one of the elements there is nuclear force modernization. So building much larger numbers of nuclear weapons that have a much broader range of capabilities, more like what the United States and Russia has. Whereas in the old days, China was estimated to have something like 200 to 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles that really can only be used to nuke like American cities or Russian cities or something like that. In other words, it just gave them the ability to retaliate against a nuclear attack. It didn't give them a capability to use nuclear weapons in a variety of missions that fell short of full-scale nuclear war. So that's the meaning of first strike and escalation dominance capabilities. First strike means the ability to attempt to knock out all of your enemy's nuclear weapons and thereby disarm their ability to strike back at you with their nuclear weapons. Escalation dominance means that you can use nuclear weapons at lower thresholds of force or in lower numbers to attain advantage in more limited conflicts, such that if you use them in these limited ways, you might be able to deter your enemy from retaliating against you with nuclear weapons and thereby use nuclear weapons to achieve military victories in a more limited wars, short of an all-out nuclear war. So as an example here, if you look at the picture, that is a DF-61, it says, a medium-range ballistic missile, often referred to as a carrier killer or a bomb killer. Okay, so it's a very precise weapon that can be used against all the American or Allied military capabilities in the Western Pacific. And it also has the most advanced type of warhead in the world now, which is called like a glide vehicle. So when the warhead is released from the missile, it goes very fast and it can maneuver, and it's more difficult to knock it out with some kind of anti-missile system. So it's an example of the kind of capabilities that China is fielding. We don't have a missile like that, at least right now we don't, but we're starting to build them. Also, China's military is shifting from like a kind of a continental military that was focused on land operations within China and around China's periphery to being a global military force which can project power around the world, more like that of the United States. And again, it's not there yet. They don't have the kind of power projection capabilities that we do yet, although they're getting there. But the point that we'll get to is that we're not going to be fighting China in South America. If we end up fighting China, it's probably going to be around Taiwan or around the South China Sea or around the Japanese islands, and that's going to be right offshore from China. So we're going to be the ones that have to project power in a conflict like that over thousands of miles. It's going to be in their backyard, and that gives them a huge advantage in terms of military competition. Okay, China has many important territorial disputes now, moving from military capabilities to actual behavior toward other states. Territorial disputes, as most of you know, are the most dangerous types of disputes because wars are usually fought over disputed territory. And it just so happens that China has a number of major territorial disputes with close U.S. allies and partners. And we'll talk about each of them briefly. Okay, so to begin with Japan, okay, we have a defense agreement with Japan. Japan is by far the most important U.S. ally in the world. I mean, there's nothing else that comes close in terms of the size of the Japanese economy, the capability of the Japanese military, the location of Japan, right in the middle of all of the potential flashpoints in Asia. If we don't have a strong alliance with Japan, we cannot compete at all in that region with China. It's an absolute necessary condition for us to be able to maintain a system of alliances and a presence in the region to have these close relations with Japan. So China has this territorial dispute with Japan over what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands and Japanese call the Senkaku Islands. As you can see there from the map, these islands are near the southern tip of the Ryukyu chain, which stretches from the main southern island down toward Taiwan, and they're also very close to Taiwan. So what happened is that these islands were taken by the U.S. during World War II from the Japanese Empire. Then in 1972, they were returned to Japan. And at that time, China also stated a claim to them, but they didn't do anything about it. They just stated that we think that these are our islands. Now, at the bottom there, you can see a graph of sea incursions. There are also air incursions, but this happens to show sea incursions into the territorial waters around these Diaoyus and Kaku Islands. And you can see that things start to heat up right at 2012. There was nothing much happening, and then all of a sudden there's constant Chinese movement into the seas and air around the Diaoyus and Kaku Islands. What happened in 2012? That was when Xi Jinping came to power. Okay, so as soon as he came to power, he is constantly sending planes and ships around these islands claimed by Japan, and there's a constant friction. So this is the primary reason why the Japanese have become gradually so much more forthcoming about defending themselves and about deterring China, because they've been spooked by this. And it's not a one-time event, or it's not a 10-time event. It's every single day, practically. In other words, if you are Japanese and you open up your newspaper or click on your website in the morning, you're seeing this stuff. So this is a big change, because obviously any kind of kinetic conflict between China and Japan is going to involve the United States, right? And every American president, because of the importance of Japan as an ally, has stated that if there is fighting over these islands, the United States is going to intervene on the side of Japan, obviously. Okay, here's another area of a territorial conflict. This is the South China Sea. So you can see Taiwan there on the upper right. So here you can see, in this map, Taiwan on the lower left. So we're kind of continuing down that island chain going southwest. Oops, wrong way. Yeah, so here we have territorial disputes between China and a number of important Southeast Asian countries, especially the Philippines and Vietnam. The Philippines is a treaty defensive ally of the United States, right? Meaning that if the Philippines is attacked, then the United States is also treaty bound, as with Japan, to come to its assistance. Okay, to interpret this now, what are those blue lines? Okay, so you may have heard before of this law of the sea, the international law of the sea. And one of the provisions of the international law of the sea is that although your territory at sea extends only 12 nautical miles from your territory on land, you have what's called an exclusive economic zone. That is, for 200 miles out from your land, you have the right to exclusively use any economic resources in the high seas. That would include mainly fisheries and minerals. Okay, so for example, if they're like oil or gas deposits or some kind of other mineral deposits that are accessible within 200 miles of your coast, then you have exclusive right to harvest and use those minerals. So the blue lines there are 200-mile distance lines from the land territory of these various countries. And what do you do if there's less than 400 miles between countries? Then you draw what's called a median line. So if there's only 300 miles between the territory of two countries, then it's supposed to be at 150 miles, where you would draw the exclusive economic zone line. So you can see the blue lines there, and then you can see this red thing, which encompasses obviously large areas of the exclusive economic zone of most of these Southeast Asian countries that border the South China Sea. What is that? That's called the 9-dash line. That's the term for it because it appeared on Chinese maps originally with 9 dashes. The Vietnamese call it the ox's tongue. It's kind of a joke, right? And very long. Like, how could China possibly claim that entire area within the red line? It seems bizarre. And of course, it was rejected by the international tribunal that regulates the international law of the sea. Just to give you some more specifics about this, so China seems to be claiming all of this territory as actual, not just exclusive economic zone, but as sovereign territory, which obviously you can't do. Even if some of these disputed islands, the most important of which are highlighted in the green on the slide there, those are called the Spratly Islands. Even if those were to give you an exclusive economic zone, which they don't according to the tribunal, because to generate an exclusive economic zone beyond your territory, the territory has to be habitable according to international law. So it can't be like a rock sticking up above the sea and then you get 200 miles around that. It has to be like an island where people can live permanently just with the resources that are on the island. So there have to be things like water, there have to be things like other sources of support. So this tribunal has decided that regardless of who owns these Spratly Islands, and they're claimed by a variety of countries, including China, none of them give an exclusive economic zone. If you own one, you only get the 12 miles around it. So under Xi, China has built these large military bases on this disputed territory. In other words, they don't just take it and occupy it, but they build these large military bases. And 3 of these reclaimed enlarged islands are on reefs, meaning that they're not permanently above water. So according to international law, no country can have territorial sovereignty over a feature which is not permanently above water. In other words, it has the status of high seas. So this is so they built 3 military bases. They dredged up a ton of sand and built supports, and they built large military bases where no country can have any sovereign rights. I mean, it's difficult to imagine something like this, right? Can you imagine if the United States were to, build offshore of some other country an artificial island and construct a military base on it? I mean, it's almost like science fiction. But she did this. It's kind of amazing. Now, again, China had these claims before, but she is putting a huge Chinese military presence into the area. He's totally ignoring international law. And he, just like with Japan, he is constantly harassing the other nations that have claims there, trying to keep their fishing boats away, trying to control their ability to navigate in the area, threatening them, demanding that they ask for permission to enter the area, maintaining this type of constant pressure. Taiwan, of course, this is the most important military dispute. For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is unfinished business from the Civil War when it took power. As most of you know, the losing nationalist party that lost the Chinese Civil War, they fled to Taiwan. And so Taiwan has been ruled separately since 1949. When the communists took over the mainland. So every communist leader has stated that Taiwan is part of China and that sooner or later Taiwan is going to return to China. However, Xi Jinping is doing it in a much more aggressive way. And again, it's interesting to look at the contrast with Deng Xiaoping. So most of you know that in the last few years, Hong Kong, which was supposed to have these continued freedoms under the agreement in which the British withdrew from Hong Kong. It's supposed to have 50 years of continuing British-style institutions. And previous Chinese leaders, that deal was made originally by Deng, and previous Chinese leaders honored that agreement. And Deng actually called it one country, 2 systems. That's his language. And he meant this to be a model for Taiwan. In other words, his thinking was, we're going to treat the Hong Kong people well. They're going to see that their life is just fine. And then the Taiwanese people are going to look at that and say, what do we need a war for we can keep our freedoms and keep our way of life, and we can make this problem go away. That was Deng's idea. Now, whether or not that would work in the long run is another question, but it's another example of Deng's subtlety and patience. It's a very good strategic approach if you don't want to go to war in the short run. It's a good approach for coming up with a way where you can have good relations with Taiwan, you can profit from Taiwan's economic potential, and you don't have to give up your goal of ultimately absorbing Taiwan into the mainland. So basically, she destroyed that, right? I mean, and when the confrontation occurred in Hong Kong, with the demonstrators that were demanding free elections, completely free elections, instead of just kind of rope-a-doping and keeping things going more or less the way they were, which is what previous Chinese leaders did, he decided he couldn't tolerate any resistance like this, and he decided he had to crush this resistance once and for all, and he ended these freedoms, even though that violated China's obligations in its treaty with Britain. So what message does that send to the Taiwanese? Obviously, if you return under Chinese rule, under whatever pretext, eventually you're going to get the fist sooner or later. It looks like sooner, based upon what happened in Hong Kong. So that means that it's very unlikely that the conflict between Taiwan and China is going to ever be resolved peacefully based upon what happened in Hong Kong. So she is sort of taking that off the table. And then along with that, there has been this, again, ramping up of military pressure on Taiwan. So initially, this wasn't as frequent, but you can see in the last 5 years or so, there's an explosion of these incursions around Taiwan. And again, it's constant now. So it's just like with Japan, only this is much more dangerous because Taiwan is much weaker than Japan, and China's military capabilities are really building up for an invasion of Taiwan. That's the primary mission of the People's Liberation Army for Xi Jinping. People now call this rehearsing an invasion, meaning that these large Chinese incursions and exercises are occurring constantly around Taiwan. And Taiwanese people are seeing this every day. And indeed, you can start an exercise and it can turn into an invasion. That's exactly what you would do if you were going to try to launch a surprise invasion. So it's really, again, maintaining this extremely high state of tension. I won't go into the conflict with India in as much detail, but again, similar pattern. Much higher level of friction along the border, and even to the point of having clashes where significant numbers of people died. This really freaked people out in India, and it really changed their attitude completely about China and what the primary threat is that they face. So, if you go to India now and talk about people that study security or even read the newspapers or something, go look at the newspapers online, they're not worried about Pakistan, they're worried about China. Right? Pakistan is like a footnote. It's weak. It's China's puppet. Can't do anything to India and so on. Okay, so to summarize this, Xi is pursuing these more aggressive territorial dispute policies in all of these areas where it has where China has territorial disputes with its neighbors. At different times, he's emphasized different regions. Right now, in recent years, it's been more the Taiwan and the Philippines, which are getting the brunt of the pressure. But it changes. For example, recently we have more pressure on South Korea, right? There are similar kind of sea disputes with South Korea as there are in the South China Sea. This is not very logical from the point of view of what's called grand strategy, right? You don't want to fight all your potential enemies at once. If you provoke everybody, they get afraid, then they start banding together. And because the logic is we can get gobbled up one at a time, or we can all resist at the same time, and then it'll be more effective. And that is indeed what has happened. So this is a little bit of a mystery, right? In other words, this is not what you want to do. What you want to do is decide what your first objective is, isolate that enemy, make sure that enemy doesn't have significant allies, try and buy them off, try and reassure them, and achieve your goals one at a time in some kind of a logical order that you have. And it would seem as if Taiwan should be the primary goal because that's the most important objective for the Chinese Communist Party itself. And actually, that's something that other countries can deal with or accept more easily ideologically than they can taking their own territory, because the status of Taiwan has been more unsettled and debated internationally. So logically, that should have been, if Xi Jinping was to become more confrontational, he should have picked a target like Taiwan and focused on that target and focused on reassuring all the other potential rivals or enemies in the region that they were not in danger. This was just a dispute with Taiwan, and there would be no dispute with any other countries. So as a result of this, indeed, there has been this coalescing or formation of a kind of a grand defensive coalition. And so you don't just have the United States with what they used to call like a hub and spokes alliance system, meaning that the United States just has these bilateral relations with various countries. You see all this kind of broader cooperation forming. So you have the so-called Quad, which is with Australia and Japan and India, and you have AUKUS in the UK, Australia, and the United States, and you have the Japanese and the Vietnamese forming ties with other countries in the region, the Indians, and so on. So you have this kind of clustering of alliance relations that indicate more and more something like a grand defensive alliance, or at least something closer to it. Okay, economic policy. So under Xi Jinping, there are very ambitious economic objectives. Okay, so Xi intends for China to assume a leading role in all major areas of high technology. Okay, so not only is China not a developing country anymore, not only is China not just one of a number of countries that take leading roles in high technology, but China is going to lead the world. And they actually list out all these leading edge industries if you go and read the documents. So the ambition is to do this with state support and with the advantages of China's scale. So you start with the home market, you protect that from international competition, and then once your industries develop a certain critical mass in the home market, then they become capable of competing internationally. So the subsidies come from the ability to charge higher prices in the home market, and then to leverage those profits, and also to leverage a variety of state subsidies, open-ended loans from the state-controlled financial system, cheap land and other inputs from local political authorities, kind of open-ended subsidies to compete economically. So this is very difficult to compete with. Okay, so if you imagine an American company, even a very advanced American company, like let's say an American networking equipment company, thinking of competing with Huawei, that's the big Chinese company that provides telecommunications equipment. So you go to some African country and you bid on their networks for this telecommunications equipment. I mean, these Huawei can sell at a large loss over and over and over again, and they have good products. So how can you compete with that? I mean, nobody gets loans from the U.S. government like this. Nobody can sell shares or take out loans on the basis that they're going to provide open-end subsidies in money-losing business ventures. You can't compete with something like that. So the tendency is just to pull out of those markets unless something changes. Direct DFI is direct foreign investment. So the Chinese are very open about this. When they can't do it themselves, foreigners are welcome to come in and do it. They have to partner with their local Chinese company. And then once the local Chinese companies develop comparable capability, then all the contracts are going to shift to those local Chinese providers, and then they're going to start to enter foreign markets. So one after the other, foreign companies, not just American companies, but foreign companies that at one time had significant market share in China in these high technology areas, they are pushed out one after the other, and it's really accelerated under Xi Jinping, who argued that not only does this need to be done for economic purposes, but it needs to be done for national security purposes, because China needs to be self-sufficient in all of these high technology areas. Financial control. Xi wants to control Chinese finances, just like he wants to control everything else in China. So the first point there, China was making moves toward having what's called a freely convertible currency. That would mean that anybody that wants to move resources from abroad into China, or anybody that wants to move resources from China to abroad can freely do that, right? So that's the way it is between, Western countries that have convertible currency. So if I want to buy Japanese stocks, or if a Japanese person wants to buy American stocks, or make an investment in the other country, we just go to the Japanese bank and we wire them the dollars, they give us the yen, and then we just make our purchases there, whatever it is we want to buy. And that buying and selling, free buying and selling internationally, is what determines the exchange rates of the currencies. Okay, so that's called a convertible system, and then you have exchange rates which are determined by market demand in that way. So they were starting to do this in China as a means of having a Chinese currency which would compete with the dollar and with other Western currencies, or like the euro or with the yen, the Japanese currency. But Xi stopped that because he wanted stability and wanted to control what would happen. And he imposed similar control over Chinese investment abroad. There was this big surge of Chinese investment as China became wealthier. They were investing in all kinds of things like the Japanese did in their day, like movie theaters and office buildings and the Ritz-Carlton and so on. But Xi said, no, we're not spending our money on that. Sell that stuff and bring your money back to China. You're only investing in technologies which are of strategic value to China, nothing else. Okay, so this whole pattern of investment abroad for China became subordinate to these economic goals. Various kind of carrots and sticks toward other countries economically. One belt, one road, or sometimes it's called the Belt and Road, translated differently, but the same thing. So this is a system of various kind of infrastructure loans, mostly to developing countries, in exchange for, obviously the loans have to be repaid in the future, and then other types of benefits. Access to contracts at various times, kinds like state procurement, like if you're building a local telecommunication system in the example I gave before. If I lend you $500 million for this railway line, I expect you to choose Huawei as your procurer for your telecommunication system. I expect you to vote in international venues like the various UN bodies or the IMF and so on, in a way which is not unfriendly to China. And also the stick. If you do something that China doesn't like, you're going to experience economic sanctions very aggressively under Xi. So some famous examples: the South Korea example, when South Korea adopted this U.S. missile defense system, which was meant to deal with these larger numbers of North Korean missiles, including nuclear-tipped missiles potentially. China demanded that South Korea just not take this missile defense system, and when they insisted upon fielding it anyway, they imposed all kinds of restraints on tourism to South Korea. They started discriminating against South Korean companies. They started to ramp up the rhetoric domestically against South Korea and South Koreans. In the case of Australia demanded a proper investigation of the origins of COVID, because the World Health Organization was heavily influenced by China and was not seriously looking into the matter. Xi responded with economic sanctions, that is, significant restrictions on imports of Australian goods. So much more aggressive carrot and stick policy internationally. With economic carrots and sticks. Intellectual property, that's the last point there. So most people are aware of things like when you invest in China, you have to have this local partner, and you have to share technology with that local partner. That's typically a condition which violates the international trade rules. But much more significantly, you just have outright theft, massive outright theft through hacking and espionage by China of other countries' technological secrets. Most people have no idea of the scale of it. Okay, so just to give you a recent number, so the estimates range in the area of $300 to $500 billion a year, the value of American technology which is stolen by China. Okay, that is real money, $300 to $500 billion. Just to give you an idea, the economic costs to the United States of global warming per year in the year 2090, after all the emissions that occur by 2090, are roughly the same. Okay, so these things should be getting similar levels of emphasis based upon the costs. But obviously people are aware of it, but they're not aware of the scale of it. So companies like Huawei, right, that are leading companies in the world, their technology is ripped off from Western companies. In that case, primarily American companies. And they're just out there selling it, and there's nothing we can do about it because other countries will buy it. China has promised under Xi to stop this, and they never have. There are a variety of related risks here from China, which have grown really large. So just to start with economic security, so the hope during the period of engagement when China was opening up and starting to develop was that China would integrate into the international economic system based upon decentralized comparative advantage, and it would assume a role gradually within the International Division of Labor in just the way that European countries did when they recovered from World War II, and just the way that Japan did when it developed this high technology capability, and just the way that South Korea and Taiwan did in their day when they developed, and so on. But that it would be on the basis of this kind of decentralized competition. Now, that wasn't really happening because of the strong power of the state within the Chinese economy. Even though it's a market economy, it's still state dominated in the sense that the state controls finance, the state has a veto over any significant economic decision made by a large enterprise. The state will oversee any strategic decision made by a large-scale enterprise. But the hope is that would gradually fade away, and that China's economic economic policies would converge toward those of countries like the United States or Japan or Germany, the European Union, etc., right? But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened is that China continued to grow richer and more technologically advanced, and started to move into more and more advanced areas. It started to compete directly with the United States and other technologically advanced countries. That's what's been happening in the last 10 years or so. And obviously that is an economic threat given the nature of the subsidies, the preferential treatment provided by China to its companies. Again, Western countries do that too. They have subsidies. Japan has subsidies and so on, but there's nothing on this scale. Right? We don't have examples of an economy with the scale of the Chinese economy and that level of centralization of financial resources, pouring these open-ended subsidies into the whole range of advanced industries. So again, this is something that it's just not possible for companies to deal with on a decentralized basis. They can't compete with it. And other advanced economies predictably are not going to allow this to go forward forever. At some point, they're going to call a halt to it, and they're going to say, we need to preserve our own industries, at least where we have some competitiveness, some comparative advantage. So they're going to start to act to block Chinese exports in these areas. Now, for other reasons, it's independently true. The same thing has to start to happen. So information security, that's another area. Another trademark activity of Xi Jinping is He wants to control all significant sources of information in China. So any information that any company has in China about its customers, about its suppliers, anything that has any kind of politically sensitive implications, all of that has to be overseen in real time by the Chinese Communist Party and its security networks. And the companies that control these various networks and communications methods, they have to follow the orders of the Chinese Communist Party and provide this kind of oversight in a way which satisfies the party. And this gets updated on an ongoing basis. This is to provide the Chinese Communist Party with maximum control in China and to prevent any sort of significant political opposition from developing. Now, if China is doing that with its own companies, guess what? What if those same companies are providing the same services in the United States or in Japan or in Taiwan? Well, they can do the same thing. Right? I mean, they can oversee every dimension of our own lives. And it's not just like in a decentralized way, like this company knows this company is selling information for this, the government gets a warrant and gets information on so-and-so. It's in a centralized way which is designed by the government. So, I mean, no country can accept that kind of foreign control over its information or its networks, right? That would be completely to cede your security to those countries. I mean, just to give you a kind of homely example, if we think about, one of the examples I'll talk about later, if we think about, cars, newer cars are all networked, right? So there's it knows what the speed limit is, and you can get your if you want some kind of special radio service or something like that, you can have a satellite connection to your car. So, what if the sensors on your cars or the various parts are controlled via a Chinese network? I mean, they can do things like shut down the cars, make the cars malfunction in various ways depending upon what the components are. Okay, military security, that's a third dimension. So all of these high technology industries have so-called dual-use applications. They can all be used in various ways to produce weaponry or things like intelligence or communication, which is necessary to fight wars. Same point, you cannot depend upon a hostile country to provide you with those technologies or those goods. It's not possible if you want to maintain your security. So for all of these interlocking reasons, we can no longer have this kind of integration with the Chinese economy, which is uncontrolled or unlimited. There inevitably was going to have to be some kind of a separation, or it's called de-risking, because it's not a total separation. That is, you focus on the areas of greatest potential threat, and you make sure that China doesn't control those, and that you and or your trusted allies and partners have your own minimum capabilities in those areas. So that is happening as a result of all of these threats emanating from China's growing economic and technological security, and it's kind of turbocharged by Xi's goals and methods. Okay, just very briefly, I'll just talk about responses in the United States. So again, to divide into these two areas, military security and economic security. So what has Trump done? This goes back to the first Trump term, and there's a lot of continuity in the Biden administration too, and then into the second Trump term. Okay, the term pivot to Asia actually goes back to Obama. This is a term that Obama popularized. But the idea was that China is the main threat emerging for the United States and need to start refocusing its resources to deal with that threat. So that is being taken more and more seriously. So for example, if you read discussions of U.S. military capability, whether on the political level or the level of warfighting geeks in the military or technical experts, they're talking about fighting a war with China. That's what they're talking about. If you go back 15 or 20 years, that was not the case. We had all these missions all over the place, and we weren't really focused on one thing in particular. This is clearly now the focus. So everything, the planning and the types of weapon systems that are being purchased, they are now increasingly focused on this potential conflict in China, above all over Taiwan, but it could be anywhere along this so-called first island chain, right? So to the northeast of Taiwan, you have those Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, and then you have the Ryukyu chain that go up to Japan, and then to the southwest, you have the South China Sea. So if China contemplates a fight against Taiwan, the military planning is that it's not just going to attack Taiwan, because that would allow the United States to launch a first strike against the Chinese invasion. The best strategy would be to launch a first strike against all the capabilities of the U.S. and its allies that are capable of stopping an invasion of Taiwan. So the way the planners envision the conflict is that it's going to be a region-wide conflict from the very beginning. That's what makes the most logical sense. So this is the conflict that the military is preparing to fight, and it has sort of an offensive and a defensive dimension. The offensive dimension is we can't have these expensive, vulnerable platforms like aircraft carriers and expensive jets that are concentrated in a few vulnerable bases, because those can be destroyed through saturation missile attacks by China and attacks by other types of weapons like drones or some kind of electronic attacks or hacking or something like that. So instead, we need to have a much more dispersed set of capabilities which can survive an initial attack and which are cheap and which can be used to launch saturation attacks against a potential Chinese invasion fleet and the follow-up resupply effort. So we have to take a leaf out of China's book. We have to have our own thousands upon thousands of cheap missiles and drones, which we can use to sink this invasion fleet, shoot down all the planes, sink all the ships which are coming to resupply the invasion fleet. So that effort is transforming the militaries of the United States and the region, as well as all the other countries. Okay, the same debate and same changes are happening in the Taiwanese military, the Japanese military, the Australians, the South Koreans, and so on, right? And then another thing that has really been Trump's signature is putting pressure on allies to spend more and do more themselves. Okay, so most of the press is about NATO related to the Ukraine war. The logic of that is pretty obvious, right? So the Russian economy is like a fraction of the size of just Germany's economy alone. How is it that Western Europe cannot defend itself against Russia? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't help them if they need our help, but they have to be able to do much more. It doesn't make sense that a significant share of our strength would be diverted to that theater. We can't afford that anymore based upon the type of threat we're facing from China. So that is changing, obviously. But within the region, it's happening. Partially this is because of pressure from Trump, and partially it's because it's happening anyway, because these states feel a much more intense threat from China. And the increases are very large. Okay, so just to give you an example, Japan announced that they're doubling their defense spending from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. That doesn't sound a lot, but Japan has a huge economy. Again, as they say, this is real money. And Japan has a real military, and it has real advanced technological capabilities across the whole range of its armed forces. And the same thing is true for South Korea. The same thing is true for Taiwan. Again, long overdue for Taiwan. Taiwan can produce all these high-end semiconductors. Why can't they crank out anti-ship and anti-air missiles at the same rate and become what they call a porcupine, right? Something that the Chinese can't swallow. It's just too costly to try and do it. So again, we can't do this alone. We can only do this if we have significant assistance from our allies. So in the Taiwan scenario, for example, the military experts say, Taiwan can't do it alone. We can't even with Taiwan do it. We also need Japan. We need the Japanese bases, and we need the Japanese military capabilities. So this needs to be a whole of alliance or partners effort because of the scale of the challenge that exists. I don't need to go into this economic policy response in as much detail. I think you're all aware of it. Okay, so the tariff bargaining and the higher baseline tariff from Trump, this is designed to achieve two goals. One of these goals is de-risking the supply chain, international supply chain, in the way that we already talked about. Examples of areas where we have significant dependence on China that has to go away, given the threat of conflict. You're all aware of rare earths and other critical minerals, things which are necessary in all kinds of high tech and military defense manufacturing. We are, 80 or 90% dependent on China for supplies of a lot of these minerals and the goods which are produced by them, such as these like high-end magnets. Intermediate goods like semiconductors, pharmaceutical precursor chemicals. Okay, so for example, like that whole alphabet soup of drugs that we all depend upon. Well, there are these advanced components that may be synthesized in these special laboratories in advanced areas like Japan or the United States or Europe, but there's this more fundamental building of the chemical basis of synthesizing the drugs where we've outsourced this to a large extent to places like China and India. Well, I mean, what if we get into a conflict with China and they can also interdict supply from other places? But we're going to stop being able to produce drugs. How long is it going to take us to provide the basic medical care that those provide to the population? I already mentioned, telecom equipment. Okay, critical infrastructure, not just supply chains, but the hardware and the software, things like the electrical grid, the telecommunications network, social media platforms. That's why the TikTok logo is up there. Okay, and then another thing which Trump has tried to do, which is more controversial, is the idea of reindustrializing the United States, that is, building up again the manufacturing capability of the United States. And, it's very debatable how far this can go and how successful it can be. But what they've settled upon is a 15% tariff, okay, which is intended to ensure some kind of minimal manufacturing capability for the United States in a lot of these areas where production had gone completely offshore or almost entirely offshore. And this is complicated and controversial for obvious reasons, right? I mean, on the one hand, you want to have as much efficiency and security as possible via the division of labor with your allies and reliable partners. On the other hand, you don't want to let that process go in a completely uncontrolled way, such that you won't be able to source things that you need to in an emergency. Okay, so for example, some of those pharmaceutical precursors, like I said, are made in India. Okay, India is probably not going to cut them off, in the event of a conflict with China, but maybe we won't be able to get them from India. Okay, so what are we going to do then? So this is very complicated. You need to try to figure this out in area after area. What needs to be made here? What can be made in Canada or Mexico? What can be made in Europe? What can be made in Japan, and so on. And nobody has the answer to this. This is one stab at it. Okay, but it's alongside this more targeted effort at China. So you can see the tariff difference there at the bottom vis-a-vis China. The figure they give now is about 47.5% average tariff. So in other words, the trade barrier to China is roughly 3 times what it is with ordinary allies and partners. So that's intended to preserve this broader division of labor with allies and partners, and to much more strictly limit the dependence on China. Just quickly, I know I'm running over here and we need to get to questions and answers. So she is not a guy that backs down or has second thoughts. He very persistently pushes forward what he wants, and he's not afraid to, as we say, break things. Okay, like Hong Kong, that's an example. Or like smashing the traditions of the Chinese Communist Party, which had been created by Deng. So that doesn't mean he's a wild man. and he can't be deterred. He can be deterred. He doesn't want to lose a war over Taiwan, obviously. If he's going to lose that war, he's not going to launch it. If he thinks he's going to lose it, he's not going to launch it. That means he can be deterred, but it's going to be difficult because of China's scale, because of the fact that the war is going to be fought close to China. It's going to require very close coordination and a big effort with all of our allies. Otherwise, we're asking for a war, and then we're going to have a choice about whether to just surrender, as let them take what they want, or fight. And neither of those things is very attractive. So it's much better to deter effectively on the front end. That's far cheaper and far more efficient. The future world economy, I'll just cut, I've made most of these points already, I'll just cut to the last bullet point there. It's going away from integration into what you could call the 2+ supply chain system. That means if there's any supply chain which is potentially dangerous to have under Chinese control, there needs to be a parallel supply chain independent of China, which is outside of China. And there might need to be more than that, because there might be further interruption of trade. So, for example, the Japanese want to have local semiconductor production. They don't trust getting it from Taiwan because it can be interrupted by a war. And they don't want to have to import it from the United States either, because that's going to be interrupted in the event of a conflict. They need to have, from their point of view, a minimum capacity in their own country. So everybody is doing this. The United States is doing this. The Europeans are doing it. These local supply chains, which are viewed as necessary for security reasons, are starting to pop up for the reasons that we've talked about it. This has already reached a very high level of momentum. Okay, so if you look at any multinational company, they're already adjusting to this. They have their investments in China to the extent that they're still worthwhile to supply the Chinese market. They have their investments in the North America area. They have their investments in the Europe area. They have their investments in the Japan area. And if they think that they need to have local production in order to have access to that market, they start building it. Okay, they don't wait for the governments to actually come up with the final plan. So not only are governments starting to impose policies to force this to happen, but all of the major international investors are already investing accordingly. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions.
All right, thank you very much. Stacy, who we remember from last week, will be working the north side of the room. I'll be working the south side of the room. And just raise your hands and we'll get to you. I don't typically do this, but I'm going to open with a question that we received online because it's a very interesting question. James wondered, would you be able to talk about the United Front Work Department and explain why Chinese people might be reluctant to talk about their government weaknesses openly?
Okay, yeah.
Very simple question.
Yeah. So the second one is much easier. When that person uses the term Chinese there, I assume I'll just answer that for Chinese that are in China, right? Chinese people that are citizens of China, right? So obviously they're afraid because the government is watching everything they do. I mean, Chinese people now in China are even afraid to have private conversations that are too sensitive, that are too critical of the government. I never saw that before Xi Jinping. So, I mean, most Chinese people don't want to be the one that sticks their head up and they end up getting a visit from the authorities. And then, it starts out with things like you can't get a loan from the bank, your children can't go to university. And it can end up with you, ending up and you disappear, you end up in a prison or so on. So that's obvious for Chinese people living in China. In terms of ethnic Chinese people living abroad, the United Front Work Department is the international outreach organization or sub-agency of the Chinese Communist Party, and it attempts to get out the message of the Chinese Communist Party through all these different venues, which it considers to be effective. And that includes things like overseas Chinese organizations of all kinds, cultural, political, economic, but it includes any other kind of organization that might deal with China in any way, that might be dealing with viewpoints that are considered to be advantageous to China. So the Chinese Communist Party has always seen these as, methods or vectors or means of pushing its ideological viewpoint in the rest of the world. And for people that the Chinese Communist Party has any influence on, that would include, consequences for their family or for their relatives back home. Like, for example, if, let's say that I'm a Chinese student here studying from China and I'm brave enough to criticize the party, I'm probably going to be observed by one of these Chinese Students and Scholars Association, which are usually controlled by the United Front Work Department. They're going to report back to the mainland about my activities, and my parents are going to be contacted, and I'm going to shut up, almost certainly, because, even if I'm willing to sacrifice my ability to go back to China and sever my relations, I don't want to do that to my family members.
You'll be next. You'll be first.
I'm under the impression Bitcoin is illegal in China because of the fact that they can't control it.
Yes. So they originally, there was crypto activity in China, but then the government became aware of these problems. I don't know for sure about illegal in a blanket sense, but they don't allow it, they don't want to allow it if, as you say, it can be used for any purpose that they can't oversee and control. So that's my impression of what they're doing. If it can be developed in a way which they can oversee and control, then fine, no problem. But you're right, they certainly wouldn't want it to be used for something like black market finance. That can be used for, criminal purposes, or it could be used for purposes of spreading political opposition.
Our fearless leader has a lot of interest in things like that.
Next question.
What is the Chinese interest in space and space technology?
Okay, that's a very big topic and a technical topic that I don't really know a lot about, but there are a number of interests it has. So obviously the most important one is that space can be used for military purposes. Okay, so GPS is used for things like, guiding missiles or mapping your enemy's, military capabilities. So they're interested in it in order to have their own military communication and mapping capabilities, and to be able to interrupt or knock out those of their rivals. That would be one interest, a direct military application. Obviously, they have the usual interests of national prestige. Okay, so if you can put people on the moon or launch missions to Mars or something like that, it shows that you're a superpower level entity. So for reasons of prestige, they're interested in that. They're interested in all the potential civilian economic applications, which we see from things like SpaceX, right, and Starlink. And there's a lot of crossover there between those different dimensions. Okay, so something that looks like it's for civilian use has military applications. So for example, like Elon Musk said, well, they may be able to knock out our satellites, but I can launch new ones faster than they can knock them out. We already see that Starlink has these kinds of applications in the Ukraine war, for example. So this is typical of things that we think of as primarily having civilian economic uses, but they also have important military applications. I don't know if that answers your question. It's the best I can do.
Over here.
Yeah.
Is she pushing the new Silk Road, the Chinese global infrastructure initiative?
Yes, so that is one of his signature policy areas, that the so-called One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative. And it involves civilian transportation infrastructure, so things like railroads and ports. It also involves what they call the digital Silk Road, which means telecommunication systems. And it doesn't just encompass Eurasia, right? It's all over the developing world. It's also in Africa. It's also in Latin America. And it's very tempting, right? So think about you're some kind of, leader in a poor country. And, this foreign entity comes along and says, I'm going to build you this fancy railroad between your capital city and the port. And you pay us back over the next 25 years. Hey, I'm probably not going to be around in 25 years. So it's a great deal up front for me. I get all these economic goodies, I get all this money, I get to pay off all my political and economic cronies, and somebody else foots the bill down the road. And probably I'm not giving up anything that I really care very much about. Okay, I give them contracts in these areas, or I support them politically in these areas. I don't care about those things anyway. So they get those benefits. They also use the expression like a debt trap, in international finance nowadays, where the reason these investments aren't being made anyway without Chinese support is that they're not economically viable, right? Otherwise, you'd be able to just take out a loan from a commercial bank and repay the loan, because this railroad, let's say, would generate enough revenue that you would just be able to repay the loan. So what do you need China for? Because it wouldn't be economical to do such a loan. So the implication of that is it's going to become an economic burden repaying this, because it's not going to generate a high enough economic return to service the loan. And then China is going to demand concessions, further concessions, give us control of this port, support us in this area, et cetera. We don't know what that is, but they negotiate. China gives them a break temporarily on the loan and so on.
Yeah, I don't believe that we should be allowing Chinese students to be attending getting advanced technical degrees here. During World War II, we certainly didn't ask the Germans and the Japanese to help us develop the atom bomb.
Yeah, it's a very important point. Here's an example of what you're talking about. You probably won't believe this, but I think this is about 10 years ago now. One of my Chinese language partners at the university, because we have lots of visiting Chinese professors at the university, and I would meet with them for an hour a week, and we would practice English and Chinese, was an aircraft engine designer in one of the most high technology universities in China, where they specialize in making aircraft engines. So aircraft engines are actually the most difficult thing to make in both civilian aviation and in high performance military aircraft. It's the most complex, difficult to master technology. That's the area where we have probably the biggest lead. And we were training professors in that area. So I couldn't believe this at the time. Then there wasn't the kind of friction that there is now with China, but even then I couldn't believe that we were doing this. So there's no question, I agree with you, and I don't think there's any disagreement about this now politically among the political class here. And they have stopped this in STEM areas, right? It's a little bit tricky because you have to draw the line somewhere always, right? Like, for example, you have to say, like, the speed limit is 55 or should be 60 or something like that, right? So we know we shouldn't have aeronautic professors coming here and mastering the most advanced skills. But what about, like, Chinese undergraduates that are just coming here to study chemistry? That's more difficult. A lot of those people end up staying here and becoming our most productive citizens. Probably they're not going to have some crucial technological role in the future if they go back to China, because that's more low end. But you have to be careful, right? You don't want that undergraduate, right? They can probably send graduate students here claiming they're undergraduates and then get them into a lab which is studying something more sensitive. So you have to watch all of that. So again, it's not a simple thing. We have imposed much stricter restrictions in these areas, but I'm sure they're finding ways around them.
Yes.
What is China relationship?
Oh, wait, question over here first. Then you.
Okay. You've made it clear that you believe that the pivot to Asia was important and perhaps crucial to us, and spend a lot of time talking about how we need our allies to step up to help us there. What do you think about the discussion that our president has a sort of 19th century sphere of influence view of the world, and that Russia, since it's got the biggest army, should be allowed to do pretty much what they want to in Europe, and we of course are going to enforce the Monroe Doctrine in Venezuela and maybe Mexico and Canada. And following from that China really should be allowed to sort of do what it wants to in this China Sea.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that would be a bad idea if it's formulated in that way. So there's a kind of, there are a few layers to this. Okay, so one point that you can make about this is like the kind of Kissinger-like point, which is that, look, China and Russia are not going to go away. As long as they're not democracies, we have to coexist with them. That means if we don't want to fight wars with them, we have to recognize their minimum national interests and sort of respect those and have relations with them that are as good as possible. On the other hand, we can't let them threaten our vital interests. And, in my opinion, our vital interests certainly include our economic and security ties, which are more global, right? Like, for example, I mean, in terms of most metrics of national power, like economic power, military power. So, East Asia and our allies and partners there are more important than Latin America. Latin America may be closer, but, Brazil is in Japan. Mexico is in South Korea and so on. I mean, Mexico is a special case because it's on our border. We have such a large population of Mexican heritage in the country and so on. So it's an unusual, special country for us. But in general, Latin America is less important strategically than places like the Western Pacific or Europe. What I would support would be something like, the old containment policy of the Cold War era, right? So if you go back and look at that, so what George Kennan said is we're not going to try to resist communism everywhere where it tries to expand. We have to focus on areas of maximum importance to us, economically and militarily. And in those areas, we have to try to make a bigger effort to have stronger allies and hold the line. And we have to prioritize different parts of the world accordingly. I don't think we want to withdraw from those areas. And I don't think that Trump is doing that, although some of the language can be interpreted that way. Like, for example, he has pretty good relations with all these East Asian countries, and he has gotten them to step up a great deal. And if you look at the national security strategy documents, they talk about this being the area of primary threat. And the U.S. military is focusing on those areas under his orders. It's also true that although we have to maintain our ties with Europe, like I said before, they can't be dependent on us to defend them against Russia. That doesn't make any sense. So they do need to bear a greater burden.
It did for 70 years.
They did for 70 years.
We have to let
They were doing
the questions keep going as they're lined up.
Yeah, they were doing a lot more, and they are doing more again now.
Okay, what is China relationship with North Korea?
Okay, so North Korea, if I wanted to summarize it, I would say North Korea is a very important lever for China to divert the attention and strength of America and its enemies somewhere else other than to deal with China. Okay, so China claims to oppose North Korea having long-range missiles and nuclear weapons, but not only did they never do anything about it significantly, but they actually provided them with economic support and military technology during that entire period. And that has diverted the attention and the strength of South Korea, Japan, the United States toward North Korea. So I think they see North Korea as an instrument of power that they can use to their benefit in the region. That's kind of a short answer.
I think we sometimes overlook the importance of Taiwan besides as a symbol. One of the examples is Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing. They control, or they make something like 95% of the chips, silicon chips. And to replace that, there's some estimates it would take 10 years for us to buy some of the etching machines that have 400,000 parts or something.
Right.
And it's also the 9th largest, most profitable company in the world. So China, if they would get control of that, we would be in sorry economic shape.
Right. So again, there's two layers to that. One is the specific areas where Taiwan is producing these irreplaceable products that are necessary for a modern economy, and that the high-end semiconductors is the most important area that you mentioned. So the solution to that is that Taiwan Semiconductor needs to move its production out of Taiwan to some extent to these other centers of economic power, and they've all demanded that. And rather than lose those markets, Taiwan Semiconductor is in the process of doing that. They are investing huge, I don't know what the latest figures are in the U.S. It's over $50 billion, I think, building those factories in the United States, and they're also doing it in Japan, and they're also doing it in Europe. So they understood that the old status quo, where this production is just in Taiwan and it can be either seized or destroyed in a war with China, is not sustainable. And so the adjustments are in the process of taking place for that particular area. More broadly, though, see, this is what I talked about before about the weird strategy of Xi Jinping, where he pushes everyone, right? So if you imagine him just focusing on Taiwan, then a lot of countries would be looking for a way out. They'd be saying, let them have Taiwan. So they'll take Taiwan like they took Hong Kong, and then we can just coexist after that. But if you think they're not going to stop there and that you're going to face further conflicts with your other allies, well, then you don't want to cede such an important economic and military asset to China. The strategists call that the cork in the bottle of the first island chain, right? That chain of islands that stretches from Japan down to Indonesia. Taiwan is like the biggest piece right there. And if that were to come under Chinese control, it would represent, a kind of tectonic loss of economic and military power. We would have to face a correspondingly more powerful and boldened China after that. And it's, under Xi Jinping at least, its goals are not limited to Taiwan.
We have time for maybe one more super easy question that is possibly a yes or no answer. Anyone? Anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Oh. Wait. Go.
A couple weeks ago, there was something in California about a house raided with a bunch of stuff. What was that all about?
Right. There was one in California, and then the same gentleman that was associated with that one in California had another one in Nevada, if I remember correctly. And these homes were raided, and they were found to have, they didn't specify, but they talked about a biologically dangerous material. There's also the Chinese scholars that have been stopped at customs with materials that can be used to cause agricultural diseases, crop diseases of various kinds. So what is this? I mean, some of it might be crazy individuals running companies, without permits or something like that, but it looks nefarious. A lot of it looks nefarious. And there's no question that China is researching these as potential methods of warfare, right? I mean, we don't talk about it for some reason, but it seems likely that COVID was an accidental release from a laboratory which does dual use research. It does research on vaccines and it does research on biological warfare. So their military literature talks about these things, they talk about people's war, meaning no holds barred war in any area where it's advantageous. So that would include things like attacks on critical infrastructure. It might include things like crop diseases. It might include things like unleashing, viruses or something like that. I mean, the old rule book is out the window. We have to prepare for anything that might happen. I don't really know any more than that. I would just say we shouldn't feel confident that this is not going to happen.
They never really said what they found. It was just that they had raided their house and it was.
And for this evening, it will need to remain a mystery. So I hate to end it, I really do. Not the smoothest start, but a great lecture, fantastic Q&A. A huge round of applause for Professor Horowitz. Hopefully you can join us next week. We're going to be moving from Asia back to Europe with Ukraine and the future of European security with Yoshika Herrera. Thank you so much for coming down. Have a great time, and I'm sorry to kick you out, but they're not my rules. I just have to enforce them. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
I learned a lot this evening, so thank you very much. I think I understand things a bit better.